What is up, guys? Daniel Plotkin here, muscle scientist and of course muscle lover, coming at you guys today with progressive overload. What is it, how to do it, how not to do it, and all of that jazz. Should you progress in the gym with sets, reps, load, instability, pauses? Why some are a complete waste of time and effort, some are great or goated, as they say, and some fall somewhere in the middle. You can throw a rock in the gym and you'd probably hit some bro who has screamed at one point or another about how you have to progressive overload. But usually this is something along the lines of you just have to make things harder over time without understanding the granular concept. And I think understanding the concept just a little bit deeper can be an unlock for a lot of people's training, and more importantly, understanding what is and isn't progressive overload and how to go about doing it. Progressive overload can be simply defined as steadily adjusting what you do to create the right internal stimulus for the adaptation that you're interested in. In this case, it would be adjusting what you do in the gym to create more growth. For a simple example, we can talk about maintenance volume. Let's say you start lifting, you do 3 sets of bench for chest, and then a year down the line, you do those same 3 sets and you've been adjusting load and making the sets hard, but it's still not cutting it for increasing your gains. You've been met by the progressive overlord, and guess what? Rent is due. In this case, the internal stimulus needs to be progressed by doing more sets. Set volume is the bottleneck for the internal stimulus that you're trying to create. But of course, there are other bottlenecks as it relates to variables that we can adjust in the gym in order to keep increasing our gains. For example, let's say we're doing a moderate to high set volume, but we do 225 for 5, let's say this week, and then 1 or 2 years down the line, we're still doing 225 for 5. In this case, we're not stressing those growth-prone fibers enough, and it's not causing enough of an anabolic stimulus because the set's just simply not hard enough. These examples are to drive home the heart of the matter. What is the adaptation you want? What systems do you need to physiologically stress to get you to those adaptations? And are you manipulating external variables in and out of the gym to create that sufficient internal stress to continue to grow? This is also a perfect time to mention what gets most confusing to people. Indicators of progress are not progressive overload. They can certainly be clues that you're applying progressive overload, but they aren't progressive overload themselves. For example, if you got stronger in a session, that's a really good indicator, but especially on short timescales, it doesn't necessarily equate one-to-one with increases in growth. By the same token, if you get in the gym and you feel weaker, that doesn't mean that you're not applying progressive overload and that session is going to be a waste. Progressive overload is all about the stimulus, and there are things that can mask your ability to perform at any given time. So we can't get anywhere near perfect knowledge of whether we're applying progressive overload just through performance at any given moment. We can, however, look at our training history and indicators such as strength over time to try to dose training or progressive overload appropriately. Progressive overload refers to the internal stimulus, while an indicator of progress, especially on longer timescales, can tell us that we've successfully applied progressive overload. But of course, the most direct indicator of growth, or successfully applying progressive overload for growth, is growth, which can be looked at in a variety of different ways, but from program to program, are your shirts getting tighter? Are your muscles looking bigger in your progress photos, circumference measures, and so on? Okay, so now that we know the internal stimulus is what matters, let's talk about what it takes to achieve that stimulus. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's start with the ugly. Making something harder for the sake of making it harder is not a good idea. A very good example of this is instability. Taking a squat and then doing a Bosu ball squat with one leg, while it's a cute and pretty awesome circus feat, it doesn't actually cause the overload that we're looking for, particularly when our goal is muscle growth. Making something harder for the sake of making it harder doesn't really make sense. For example, we can also just hold our breath or do something really stupid in order to make an exercise harder, but the imminent fear of death or injury is making it harder for all the wrong reasons and would be counterproductive for our goal of stressing those growth-prone fibers. Then for a step up, we can talk about pauses and tempo. as a form of progressive overload. It's technically possible to continue to progressive overload or create the right internal stimulus by adding pauses and doing different tempos because we're continuing to make the sets hard enough. However, I wouldn't recommend changing tempo or how you go about doing your pauses during a program. I would make that decision before you start the program and then run it through. I've ran studies where tempo was more strict, and often it takes a lot of practice, a metronome being watched, and still people tend to lie to themselves, even when you have the metronome to tell them that they weren't going at the tempo that they thought. So this, along with other reasons, makes it harder to track progress when you make these manipulations, but fundamentally, it's also just really a different exercise, even if it's a minor change. Keeping everything with the exercise execution allows for things to be relatively constant from a physiological context, and there's a bunch of other tools that fit into this category where you're technically changing the exercise, it's harder to create the same physiological stimulus, and it's harder to track progress or have those indicators that we were talking about earlier. This includes pausing at different points, so not necessarily pausing at the bottom, but having a pause at the bottom or a pause in the middle, common for strength athletes, or more extreme versions, such as switching to a single leg version of an exercise, or probably the worst version of this, which is choosing a completely different exercise that's just harder. Working at a big box gym, it was extremely common to see this. You start somebody off on a more simple exercise, such as a lunge or a squat, and then, for your own weird reasons, you progress them to a single leg pistol squat or a Turkish getup or something else that for whatever reason you decided was harder to execute. That was actually a regression, not a progression to the goal that the individual is really after, which is usually body composition related, fat loss, muscle gain, and not how to execute some weird exercises. So now we've come to the gold standard progressions, reps and load. The tried and true. These are great because you can keep execution constant, but increase a rep or a few pounds as you get stronger. But which one is better? Turns out they are both good to go in most contexts. I actually ran a study examining this exact question for my master's degree where we had individuals come in, we tested their 10 rep max, and one group stayed at that 10 rep max the whole study, so only progressed in reps, while the other group, as they got stronger, progressed in load to stay within the 8 to 12 rep range. After the 8 weeks, we found very little differences between groups. Another study, which was basically a replication, used a within subject design and a leg extension and found basically the same exact results. Whether you increased in reps or load, it didn't matter to the gains that you got. One thing to keep in mind is that for strength gains, obviously touching heavier loads more often would be a good idea. Okay, so since it seems to not matter too much for the gains, staying between 5 and 15 and progressing in either reps or load is probably good money. And you can choose where you want to be within that 5 to 15 depending on the exercise, preference, and a lot of other individual factors. I like to often do what's called a double progression. So I'll have 3 rep ranges in my program, 5 to 7, 8 to 11, and 12 to 15, and I'll keep exercises within one of those 3 ranges, and then as I get to the top of that rep range, I'll add load and recycle back to the bottom of that rep range. But if I'm being totally honest,
super duper honesty time,
even if I didn't reach the top of that rep range and I'm feeling a load increase, I'll just do that. So kind of a willy-nilly, not so double progression, but you get the point. So don't tell my coach, who happens to be my other personality. Hopefully he doesn't stumble upon this YouTube video. Progression, oh, that seems interesting. Oh, that's my client. Huh, just increase load when you want. I'm gonna kill this fucker. Okay guys, to summarize, think of progressive overload as adjusting the internal stimulus, and it gets less confusing. To create this appropriate internal stimulus, progressing in reps or load is tried and true and often makes the most sense. However, depending on the context, you can mess around with some of the others as needed. As always, like, comment, share with friends, not enemies. Until next time, peace.